All right, good morning and welcome to the Center for Race and Public Education, the South Race and Education Lecture Series. I'm Dr. Alexa Rodriguez, a Mellon Postdoctoral Research Associate in the School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia. As we begin today's lecture, please join us in acknowledging and paying respect to the traditional custodians of the land we are on today, the Monacan people. Our acknowledgement of the Monacan Nation reflects our commitment to a culture of inclusion by honoring those who are here first and whose continued presence is important to our future. We also acknowledge and pay respect to the individual lives of the African peoples who were sold and held in enslavement here. These enslaved peoples built and sustained the everyday life of the university. We also acknowledge the contributions made by immigrants from Asia and Pacific Islands who have endured decades of persecution and bias while seeking a better life here for their families and communities. We recognize the pain that surfaces for them as a result of the rise of anti-Asian American hate crimes. Before I turn it to Dr. Johnson, I did want to mention a couple quick housekeeping items. This is a Zoom webinar, which means as an attendee, you cannot use your video or microphone. So we're going to facilitate a Q&A session following Dr. Johnson's presentation. And we encourage you to utilize the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and that will be addressed directly during the designated Q&A time. If you'd like to engage with Dr. Johnson directly during the Q&A session, we welcome you to use the raise your hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will unmute you for you to ask your question at that time. So this talk is also being recorded and excerpts from it will be available in the center's YouTube channel afterwards. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Johnson for today's talk. Dr. Johnson is a citizen of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma and a descendant of the Sac and Fox Nation. She is Bird Clan and belongs to the Tallahassee Band. Currently, Dr. Johnson is a postdoctoral research associate at the Janine Rainbolt College of Education at the University of Oklahoma and was a 2020 National Academy of Education / Spencer Foundation Dissertation Fellow. Her dissertation, The Broad Daylight of Knowledge, Seminole Education, 1843 to 1930, describes how the Seminole Nation asserted its sovereignty through its educational institutions. Her research interests also include the history of education in Indigenous communities, Indigenous language revitalization, and Indigenous historical educational research methodologies. In addition to her research on Indigenous communities, Dr. Johnson is also heavily involved in the Seminole education projects. Prior to her doctoral studies, Dr. Johnson was an elementary school teacher on tribal reservations in Arizona and Florida. In 2010, she was the first recipient of the Heritage Award and was honored by the Seminole Nation for her efforts in language revitalization. Dr. Johnson was also co-founder of the Emmahaga Immersion School, a language learning school for early childhood education through college students in the Seminole Nation. Now, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Johnson.
Thank you for that, Alexa. I'd first like to thank the organizers of this lecture series, as well as Dr. Rodriguez and Dr. Allridge, Caroline and Emily, and all who have helped to organize this event so that we could all be in community with each other today. I was born within my tribal homelands in my nation's capital of Wewoka, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And I really leaned heavily upon the work of Kevin Mulroy, who wrote about the Seminole Freedpeople. He actually traces enslavement for the Seminole people to the occupation of what is now known as Florida by Spain and Britain. And so the Spanish colonization of Florida was key to the development of the first free Black town, which was located near St. Augustine. And I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, so I'm going to just preface it by that, but I'll try. Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. And this was in 1783, but prior to that time, in 1687, there was a group of 11 individuals that arrived in this area seeking freedom. The town quickly grew to over 100 people by 1738, and the townspeople of Mose were made up of free Blacks, freedom seekers from enslavement, and what the Spanish termed Indian people. Mosaic was actually situated between competing colonial powers and freedom seekers who found refuge under the Spanish crown. And it is often referred to as one of the first underground railroads because instead of seeking freedom up north, people were actually relying upon indigenous allies to head south because they sought refuge in Spanish occupied lands. And when arriving into the area, they would have to actually convert to Catholicism, and the men would have to serve in the military, the Spanish military. So prior to the Revolutionary War, Mosaic really served as a critical freedom point from enslavement in the Carolinas and Southern planters. The town also became a target for Southern planter blocs who saw Mosaic as a threat. So the formation of this free Black town was the first line of defense for Spain and led to alliances between Mosaic and tribes local to the area. These alliances would serve as a catalyst for future relationships. And so during this time, there was really a big military alliance that took place. But when I was doing my research, I wondered because, you know, the Seminole Nation has a history of enslaving people, and I kind of wondered how that came about. So I was really looking heavily at some of the work on Seminole Freedpeople, and Kenneth Porter's scholarship asserted that Seminole enslavement actually began during the first 2 decades of English rule, when Seminole leaders first noticed the value that the English and Spain had actually placed upon enslaved people. The Seminole enslaved primarily via captivity during warfare or through purchase or as gifts from the English crown. And historians that have studied the freedmen tend to agree that those enslaved by the Seminole lived in villages near their enslavers pre-removal. So the enslaved grew crops, raised livestock, and were expected to pay tribute to Seminole leaders in annual amounts. The Seminole people did not enter into the planter economies of cotton or crops, which really kind of made them distinct from other tribal nations in the Southeast. So although Seminole economy was not centered around these Southern planter blocs, Seminole leadership often constituted the majority of the enslavers, and their descendants would then take on as enslavers of men, women, and children when their leaders passed away. As Florida came under British rule and later the United States, the nearby Black and Seminole communities were targeted by Southern planters and military occupation. And as federal policy and US military aggression amped up, the Seminoles and Black communities faced immediate threats. Black freedom seekers witnessed the treatment of the enslaved by Florida planters and their overseers, and many of them had escaped from those Southern plantations and had actually headed toward Florida in search of freedom. However, their well-being was not always guaranteed among the Seminole. They were still enslaved and they had the potential to be sold. Military aggression against these communities, driven by congressional policy of Indian removal, escalated into what would become 3 Seminole Wars. And the Black communities were very important allies, and their leadership proved to be critical to the resistance of the Seminole during the wars. This photo here on the next slide, taken from the US Marine Corps archives, illustrates how our people were hunted down, and really speaks to the alliance that we had against an invasive US military. The US policy of Indian removal resulted in our people being forcibly removed from our homelands in what is now Georgia, Florida, and Alabama to Indian Territory, or what is now called Oklahoma. And in the words of one of our tribal elders, the late Joanna Palmer Morris, it was a time of great sorrow for our people. So the United States policy of extermination and the threat of the Southern planter bloc and potential for re-enslavement bolstered this resistance alliance, because these policies really pose deep threats to these communities. And similar to the relationships that were seen in Mosaic, the Seminole and Black alliance was so strong that the US military realized that it would need to attack this bond of this coalition. And so there were 2 war leaders that really emerged from this time that had a strong bond. Osceola and John Horse were 2 war leaders of this alliance that were really close. And there was a US military general named Jessup, who recognized that the enslaved and free Blacks would only negotiate if guarantees of freedom were on the tables. And these leaders were they were really tired of like having to live life under this threat of danger, always on the run. So some of the free and enslaved Black leaders who served as interpreters between the Seminole and the United States military utilized their knowledge of the English language, and they really utilized that to negotiate their terms of freedom. all were forced to make extremely difficult decisions under extenuating circumstances because there were still enslavers from the southern plantations who were traveling to these sites to make claims to what they deemed as property. So this forced removal to Indian Territory was just this time of tremendous upheaval. The enslaved and free Blacks both worried that if the military would give in to the demands of these Southern planters, that they would face re-enslavement and return back to the Carolinas. And the US military leaders who were placed in charge of negotiating the terms of removal knew that if their claims were upheld, it would really slow the process of removal. So these Southern planter blocks that were coming, they were really frustrated because governmental agents, they hastened the orders for removal. And so that process would be expedited, and forced migration and removal for Seminoles, enslaved people, and free Blacks then started to commence to what was known as Indian Territory, or later Oklahoma. Mary, a Seminole freedwoman who served as a cook for one of the missionaries, recounted the experiences that they faced during this war. She told a story about how they were always on the run, and that at one time they came close to being discovered by soldiers in the US military. And she said the soldiers went past us, never looking to the right or left, just as regular soldiers do. And when they were going past, there was a little child belonging to a woman named Rose who began to cry. And all the other people that were hiding really urged that mom to silence the baby, because if they were found, they would all be taken, and they would all be rounded up. And so the mom was forced to silence the baby, but luckily the child survived. And this narrative illustrates how those that were escaping the military regiments were often forced to make difficult sacrifices during the wars. Mary's memory of that time also demonstrates that the effects of the Seminole Wars were shared among the Seminole Freedpeople. Although some had negotiated terms of freedom, there was no guarantees that these terms would be upheld in their new homelands. And during their journey, thousands of our people were actually imprisoned at this picture on the right. This is a picture of Fort Pike, Louisiana. It's a relatively current view of what the fort looks like, and it's located in Orleans Parish between Lake Pontchartrain and Lake, probably not saying this right, but I'm saying Bourne. But it was really held in marshy, kind of brackish waters, and this area wasn't ideal conditions. I've seen photos of some of the kind of the photos that are more current today, but when you think of a prison system, like this is really an example of what that was there. And our people were really held in chains in that area. And, you know, on one side was just totally surrounded by water. So I show these photos because when I talk about the development of schools within the Seminole Nation, these events were integral to our people's push for education. The early development of schools within Indigenous nations were actually propelled through funds administered through the Department of War. And so on one hand, we have the military engaged in this type of war, and on the other hand, Congress supported war in another type of way. In 1819, Congress appropriated $10,000 to missionaries to carry out the aims of civilization. And so when I think about that dollar amount today, that's a lot of money. But can you imagine how that amount would have played out in 1819? That would have been just a huge sum. And it was really a very heavy financial incentive for religious organizations to move into Indigenous nations. And as Dr. James Anderson reminded us in his seminal work on the education of Blacks in the South, we really see the allure of funding disguised as benevolence. And so it was very much similar. It played out very similarly within Indigenous nations. For us, it started out a little bit differently. This next photo that I have is a photo of Tallahassee Miko, or John Bemo was his English name. He was actually born around 1825, and when he was younger, he was on a trip to St. Augustine with his dad, and his dad ended up actually passing away unexpectedly. And during that time, he was taken in by French sailors, and he actually ended up sailing around the world in his youth. And it was there that he converted to Christianity. When he returned to the area, he tried to find his mom and the rest of his family, but the Seminole Wars were still ongoing until 1858. And he learned that they had been removed. He traveled to Indian Territory where he found our people, but he learned that his family ultimately did not survive. Tallahassee Miko saw that the US government was not upholding agreements. They weren't issuing the rations that they said they would, that our people were actually starving in the new lands. And so he ended up returning east to raise funds to help our people. And he subsequently went on to develop the first school that he named Prospect Hill in 1842. He and his Muskogee wife, Harriet, were the first teachers. And he was a very eloquent speaker, and he advocated against genocidal policies and really was a strong advocate for education. He was very likely faced with the really tough choice to either remain in the school and teach or to explore alternative methods to contribute to the well-being of the people. He returned once again to the East to embark upon a lecture tour to raise money for the Seminole people to combat starvation. And that's the way he kind of supported himself, was going around and lecturing and charging for his appearances. And the topics of his lectures always centered around the plight of the people. He clearly saw himself as an advocate to advance the conditions of Seminole people in their new lands. And it was during one of these trips between 1846 and 1847 that a white missionary, John B. Lilly, became acquainted with John Bemo after attending one of his speaking engagements. As John recounted his efforts to advance the Seminole people and fundraise, John B. Lilly was intrigued. And he was really interested in serving the Seminoles in another way. He chose to travel west towards Indian Territory with his growing family. And by 1847, John Bemo set about building a log cabin for this new missionary family that was coming to the Seminole Nation. This log cabin would serve as the site of the second school established within the Seminole Nation. And John Bemo continued to have considerable influence over the well-being of his people. As the Civil War was approached, he was noted for stopping the efforts of a Baptist missionary that was trying to persuade Seminoles to join the Confederacy. And although he was maligned, like within the community by this missionary, many accounts indicate that a lot of people supported him by testifying to his character and his faith. And he continued to serve as a teacher in the next school that he built with the assistance of the Lillies, the Oak Ridge Mission. But the reception to the missionaries was not always well received. The development of early schools was really a divisive issue among tribal leadership. Mary Ann Lilly, one of the first missionary teachers in the area in 1848, noted that the Seminole leader, Micanopy, had given her husband permission to develop a school, but she started to encounter resistance from Kawakoji, one of the Seminole war leaders. And she stated, "At first, they thought we wanted to get their children and then send them away and perhaps make slaves of them. But when they saw that we treated the children kindly, they began to think better of us." And the Lillies really had the support of and worked in tandem with Tallahassee Miko, and that undoubtedly contributed to the school's early support among our people. When other religious denominations approached Seminole leadership about starting schools, tribal people would reiterate their respect for John Bemo and encourage them to really come and teach their own children. But meanwhile, the missions also still had that strong support from the United States government. By 1850, the Secretary of the Interior's report included details to illustrate the drive to acquire indigenous land was very much a critical point to further the nation state. And the report asked, "The question forces itself upon the mind of the statesman and the philanthropist. What is to become of the Aboriginal race? This question must be fairly met. A temporizing system can no longer be pursued. The policy of removal, except under peculiar circumstances, must be abandoned, and the only alternatives left are to civilize or exterminate them. We must adopt one or the other." The United States government didn't know what to do. They were still trying to make the decision. And they viewed the tribes in the original homeland as a problem. And so while this was going on, while Tallahassee Miko was in Indian Territory, we still had people in Florida that were still undergoing war. In 1854, the Florida legislature outlawed any trade with any of the Seminoles still in Florida. And they hoped to force this removal of the remaining Seminoles by severing any means of securing ammunition or supplies. But once they removed the tribes and forced us to move west of the Mississippi River, they were still contemplating extermination. So this really posed quite a conundrum to their ideals of American expansionism. And as Wolf reminds us, the goal was to eliminate complex societies of indigenous people to strengthen white settler claims to territory. By 1853, the Secretary of the Interior reported that ample provision should be made for educational purposes. The missionary establishments among them, which have been very successful in converting many to Christianity and reforming and civilizing them, should be fostered and encouraged. In the Seminole Nation, there was really a competition between the Presbyterians and the Baptists to see who could get more people converted to their denomination. And these denominations affected the relationships in the Seminole Nation. Joseph Murrow was a Baptist minister who set up his church within the Seminole Nation. And then we also had the Presbyterians ongoing, like with the Lilly family, and later James Ross Ramsey, who came into the picture. But despite this turmoil, during the next few decades, the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians began to situate their religious organizations among the Seminole. They worked to further the missions by establishing institutions of learning throughout the nation. But this work was halted during the Civil War, as many missions during that time abandoned their posts in order to seek safety. And as I went about my research, I wondered how supportive the religious organizations were to the Seminole Freedpeople. The Civil War really highlighted the alliances that people made, many in accordance to their religious denomination. So when the Civil War broke out, the Seminole Nation was really split between the Union and the Confederate South. Melinda Miko found that although the majority of Seminoles sided with the Union and left their nation to seek protection in Kansas, a portion did remain in Indian Territory and sided with the Confederate States at the end of 1861. The greatest majority of them were heavily pro-Union, and they refused to meet with officials from the Confederate States and voiced their wishes to remain loyal to the treaties that they had signed with the United States government. In March of 1861, the Seminole Nation formally opposed a treaty with the Confederacy during a council meeting. However, some Seminole Confederate loyalists pledged their allegiance to the Southern group and signed a treaty of friendship with the Confederate Army. And again, these groups were really heavily influenced by missionary ideologies. The Seminoles that sided with the Confederacy were heavily influenced by Reverend Morrow. When he came into the Seminole Nation, he immediately segregated church audiences. And when the Confederate Army was, looking for people to volunteer, he actually volunteered and served within this army. The Seminole chief at that time, John Jumper, was a Baptist minister. He was also an enslaver and headed up a Confederate regiment. Numerous Seminole and Seminole Freedpeople, known as the Loyal Seminoles, headed north to Kansas and followed leaders such as John Chupko. Some of these men later served with Union troops. During one particular heated battle in Indian Territory, there were pamphlets written in different tribal languages that were actually distributed among the free people of all of the tribes, notifying them that they were free, but they weren't actually free yet. Although the United States had abolished slavery in 1865, many of the Confederate enslavers wielded power and asserted that they were not actually under the laws of the United States. Freedom for some of the enslaved wouldn't actually occur until 1866. Some of the Seminole leaders assumed white settler ideologies which governed their interactions with the Seminole freedmen. During later months, the United States government appointed an official to evaluate the progress that had been made. And actually ended up meeting with the loyal Seminole representative who said, we receive them as brethren on the same footing and rights, but they didn't want to take in any other people that were coming into their nation. And they said, we'll take care of them without any aid from the federal government. Although there was dissension that simmered from the Confederate Seminoles, the new leaders of the Seminoles signed the Reconstruction Treaty in March of 1866. And Article 2 of the treaty says, and as much as there are among the Seminoles many persons of African descent and blood who have no interest or property in the soil and no recognized civil rights, it is stipulated that hereafter these persons and their descendants and such other of the same race as shall be permitted by said nation to settle there shall have and enjoy all rights of native citizens, and the laws of said nation should be equally binding upon all persons of whatever race or color who may be adopted as citizens or members of said tribe. So this signing of the treaty really marked a new era of relationships among the people. And the Seminole Nation was actually the first tribal nation to sign the 1866 treaty. And the period between the 1866 treaty and state formation was a period of growth within the nation as people started to really choose home sites. They were able to really start to establish their crops again and establish communities. For many, there was a recognition that the nature of education for a tribal nation was starting to rapidly change. At the missions, the religious organizations really differed in their approaches and treatment of the Seminole Free People. The Presbyterian missionaries did not appear to really enact segregationist policies in churches prior to the Civil War. And it is very, very likely that the Seminole Free People were also educated by the Lilies, Tallahassee Miko, and Reverend Ramsey at the Oak Ridge Mission. Mrs. Lilly had noted in her journal that when she was stationed at Tallahassee Mission in the Muskogee Nation around 1842, their congregation was actually comprised of mostly free people. She wrote in her journal, "I used to get them together every Sabbath morning and teach them spelling. And Robert was very anxious to learn, and he would go with the boys, but after he learned a little while, he stopped. On Sabbath morning, I had a class and he would come with others and teach out of some simple books." Robert, also referred to as Robin, was a freedman who served as the interpreter for the Reverend Ramsey. Although Mary and Lily had taught Robert, they also happened to support enslavement policies within the Muskogee Nation in other ways. So Mrs. Lilly noted that they paid Robert's enslaver for his service, and Robert was only allowed to keep at 1 day's wages, even though he had worked more days than that. And so this was around 1842. So this was prior to the Civil War. It is very likely that they attempted to really teach everyone how to read and write, because the more people that could read the Bible would ensure their conversion to Christianity. When Robert moved to Oak Ridge Mission, Mrs. Lilly also recorded some of the enslavement raids that occurred in the Seminole Nation. She noted that the enslaved were supposed to have their freedom in Indian Territory, and when it didn't happen, many of them still lived under military protection at Fort Gibson. So the brother of one of the U.S. federal agents, agent to the Seminoles, Duval, and a lawyer actually worked out an agreement with some Seminole enslavers to turn over a number of the enslaved to them. It doesn't appear that the Lilies and Tallahassee Miko supported these activities. And Mrs. Lilly's recollection, she noted that when enslavers came to the mission and Tallahassee Miko tried to warn the free Black men who worked for them, but they ended up holding Tallahassee Miko up by gunpoint, and so he couldn't warn him in time to hide. Mrs. Lilly also wrote about seeing the Seminole war leaders Kawakuji and John Horace leave the Seminole Nation for Mexico with the contingent of Seminole Free People, and they were really heading to Mexico for freedom. So there were also accounts that highlight their missionary visits to freedmen and free people communities. And when the Civil War broke out, Tallahassee Miko and the Lilies ended up going north with the Union. So I really feel like these actions demonstrate very strong possibility that they didn't support the Confederacy in any way. Within years after the Civil War, during the Treaty of 1866, there were actually ended up being two Indian schools and two Free People schools. And the Seminole agent Bruner actually lauded the Bruner Town School for Freedmen Children as the most complete and comfortable schoolhouse in the nation. So the Seminole Free People students could attend any school within the Seminole Nation, but many of them chose to attend their own neighborhood schools. And this was very likely due to the community investment in their education and the proximity to their homes. The Seminole Nation ended up contributing educational funds to the development of all of the schools. More missionaries moved into the area as the years went on. And so this photo here is of an early Seminole school at the Wewoka Mission. The white woman in this photo back here at the back wall is Antoinette Snow, and she taught Seminole and Seminole Free People children beginning in 1874. Mulroy's earlier research on Mrs. Snow highlights her views in educating all students, and her journal really reveals, she said, "I make no differentiation in my work on account of race or color. They are all bright children. All must be educated and Christianized. There was ostracism on the part of many because of the education of the two races together, but God that made the world made of one blood all nations of men." And she really believed that students learning together enrich both Seminole and Seminole Free People students. Her account also highlights her missionary drive to convert people to her Presbyterian faith. So these early educational experience really likely made very strong impressions on the minds of these young children. The Seminole Free People students had a strong command of both the English and the Muskogee language. And she noted that they often contributed to the education of students that only spoke the Muskogee language. So they really helped her interpret what she was teaching. She was supported in her efforts by John Chupko, who served as the Seminole Nation chief at that time. Seminole Freedmen student Carrie Marshall Pittman reported that she also attended the school with Mrs. Constant. And so these students that attended these schools would often return back to their communities as teachers. Dave McIntosh, a Seminole freedman that was born in 1879, attended an Indian day school north of the Seminole Nation's capital of Wewoka and the Seminole Freedpeople community of Nobletown. And he stated that his teacher was Louisa Bruner, who was the daughter of Caesar Bruner, an influential Seminole freedman leader. And so the young woman sitting at the organ is Louisa Bruner. And her father was really an influential leader. So Louisa actually played an important part, and she actually has ties to Hampton Institute. She went on to Hampton Institute after she finished her school, and she came back to serve as a teacher within the Seminole Nation. This next slide shows her graduation announcement from Hampton in 1885, along with her intended occupation. She played an integral role in the education of students, and because she was a student of Mrs. Snow's, she was reportedly one of the teacher's favorites. She was a devout student, and she seemed to understand early on her calling in life. So when she graduated from Hampton, she returned to teach at Thomastown in Indian Territory and later at Nobletown. She was the first Seminole freed person to serve as a school teacher. In her first school in Thomastown, she reported that she had 63 students, and in the second school, she had almost the same number of students. So she was really popular. Less than 2 decades after the abolishment of enslavement within the Seminole Nation, there was just a proliferation of schools that were established in Seminole Freedpeople communities. So from the large number of students in her class, education was very important to the community. Growing up within the Presbyterian faith had also made a strong impression on young Louisa. And she stated, "I have a full Sunday school. All of the children of the day school come and others. The parents also come and take part. I'm not married. I think I can do more if I am single and I have no home cares. I own a couple of ponies, 14 head of cattle, and the rest in cash. I want to be a missionary with God's help. The general condition of our people and the way of living is very promising. Education has been so neglected so long, it makes them very slow in getting on." So she had really strong sentiments about the importance of Christianity and education. And her work as an educator also impacted her role in the community. So because her dad was also so well respected, it probably played out to the family. The community must have really trusted her a great deal, because her role as an educator also affected her Sunday school attendance. And she was confident that she would do well as a single woman. So when I read that statement about her, I really looked at that and said, that's really an affirmation of a gender role that are really patterned after matrilineal lines that were common in the Seminole Nation. She was also reflecting on the promise of education and opportunity that there was, and her hope likely stemmed from her own educational experiences. Louisa's education provided her with opportunities that took her far from her family in Indian Territory, and this was a testament to her character. So she likely had opportunities that could have taken her to new places after she graduated, yet she returned home to serve her people. Another student at the Seminole Mission Schools was J. Cody Johnson, a Muskogee freedman whose family had connections to the Wewoka area. He also attended school with Louisa Bruner, and he was a precocious student. His talent was supported by the Seminole Nation, who sponsored his college education at Lincoln University, a historically Black university located in Pennsylvania, where he graduated in 1884. His Muskogee name, Kachalesti, translated to the Black Panther, and his knowledge of the Muskogee language contributed to his ascension to some of the highest leadership roles within the Muskogee and Seminole Nations. At the Muskogee Nation, he served in the House of Warriors, and it is said that when he was going to do a speech or speak on matters that were pertaining to the Muskogee people, all of the full-blood Indians would attend to hear what he had to say. At the Seminole Nation, he actually served as a private secretary to Hulbut-Amico, who was the chief at the time. Hulbut-Amico did not speak English, so one of his first acts when he got into office was to actually assign signature authority over the Seminole Nation to Kachalesti. So he was a prominent lawyer in the area, Mr. Johnson was, and through his lifetime, he amassed great wealth. And one white lawyer in the area recollected that there was nothing that Cody ever possessed that was not at the behest of his community if they needed it. He was also very well regarded at the national level. Booker T. Washington was a friend who visited Mr. Johnson at his ranch. And I kind of wondered if maybe there they might have exchanged ideas about education, because when Mr. Johnson passed away, he left a significant portion of his estate for the establishment of a school for Black children. This next photograph is of a photo of Emmahaga School, and my great-grandmother actually attended this school for a short period of time. So it was newly constructed between 1892 and 1893, and it really offered a liberal arts education. It was fully integrated. The school was a hub for local social life, as community members would often bring in wild strawberries or pecans to barter for bread. The schools learned the fine arts, and they often ended each school year with a closing commencement performance that was attended by the local community. William Packer Blake, who is this man standing right here, served as superintendent from 1894 until 1906, and he said that his relationships among our people were appreciated. Caesar Bowlegs, one of the Seminole Freedpeople leaders, even referred to him as the father of all the Seminole children, because the girls who attended Emmahaga so fondly looked upon the school, they would send their own children as well when they had their children. The structure of education among the Seminoles included a school superintendent that was appointed by and reported to the tribal council. And so when the United States Superintendent of Schools was doing their reports in 1884, they indicated that the schools of the 5 tribes were not included because the schools were being financed and managed entirely by the tribes. So by then, some of the missionaries retained a certain respect among Seminole people, and teachers began being approved by church boards prior to placement. By 1895, it was reported that there were 2 boarding schools and 6 day schools within the Seminole Nation. Most importantly, Seminole agreements with the government did not vest the power in the federal government to assume control of their schools. The academies were influenced by Christianity, yet in some ways the school retained Seminole culture and language. This next photo here is of the Miccosukee Mission, and it was actually an exact replica of Emmahaga. The schools were state of the art, and they enjoyed steam heating on each floor, which was a luxury for that time. Students said that they went to school because they wanted to, not because they were forced to. And while the earlier schools utilized liturgical texts that were written in this Muskogee language, there were also curriculum that included stuff like this. So these are actually stories that were written entirely in the Muskogee language. And the students that attended, so the Seminole and Seminole Freedpeople students were actually speakers of the language. So they were actually learning also literacy in their language. So I really appreciate the handprints. I always say this on this book because you can really tell that this curriculum was really heavily utilized. So at the Miccosukee Mission School, it was also fully integrated, and there was a student, his name was Primus Dean. He attended this school. He was a Seminole freedman, and he attended from the time he was 6 or 7 until the time he turned 14. He recalls being Jim Crowed out of school around 1910. So although the state of Oklahoma passed a law that ordered segregation, these laws didn't really affect the Seminole Nation until later. About a decade prior to state formation, we really start to see the influence of the United States government. So this next slide highlights the official who started to really change the course of Seminole education. In 1899, he arrived within the Indian Territory, and he was actually sent to serve as U.S. Superintendent of Indian Schools, but his presence wasn't really viewed positively by the tribes. He was surprised to find, I soon learned that each of the 5 tribes had its own schools, its own school law, their own school systems, their own school buildings, their own teachers, and they have been in operation for half a century or longer, during which all of the time the federal government has had nothing whatsoever to do with them because they've been constructed, managed, and maintained exclusively by the tribes. By 1903, the Norman Democrat was reporting on the status of schools within the 5 tribes. The headline heralded Indian Territory as the land of schools and noted that the Indians have a good system of schools. They also noted that they are better educated as a class than the white people of this country. So simultaneously, while this was going on, there were also federal policies that were providing much needed support to the invasion and theft of lands in Indian Territory. So the Dawes Allotment Act was an allotment act that was actually passed to break up communally held land into small allotments to be held back, distributed back to individuals. And so these federal policies really started to affect the classrooms. And the representation of the United States government via John Benedict was a threat to the educational autonomy of tribal nations. And the Seminole Nation, long situated education policies of integrated schools became contested as he began a campaign to dismantle tribal schools. Once he got into office, he actually started to enact federal policies within tribal nations that diverted funds that were directed to tribal nations, and he would actually direct them to coffers that were designed to develop schools for white students. Access to schools meant that access to lands would be accomplished more effortlessly, as schools for white students would establish permanency and advance settler claims to territory. By 1904, there were teacher certificates that were being issued within Indian Territory, and they were actually being stamped with allow white children to attend school for free. So years before official Oklahoma statehood, the federal government really began this shift prior to ramp up and support state formation. From the onset of the white settlers in both the Indian and Oklahoma territories, they really began aggressively pursuing statehood. Jimmy Lewis Franklin noted from 1890 to 1897, the statutes provided for local option with the decision to segregate determined by popular ballot at the county level. The 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case, in which the Supreme Court upheld segregation, also affected the education of Black students in school. These actions bolstered segregationist policies down to the local level and emboldened school officials to deny schooling for Black students. But these policies stood in stark contrast to the Seminole Nation's educational institutions. Many of the Black towns were concentrated in Indian Territory, and with the Dawes allotment, Seminole Freedpeople were also allotted lands. This contributed to the development of business enterprises like the ones built by J. Cody Johnson, and education within the Seminole Nation really remained strongly rooted in community. At a meeting in Guthrie in Oklahoma Territory on November 20th, there was a constitutional convention that formally convened. And so the chair of the convention was William Alfalfa Bill Murray. He settled in the Chickasaw Nation, and he served as an advisor to the Chickasaw governor, Douglas Johnston. He was a white supremacist, and he made his views very clear. Murray's view, at the convention, he actually segregated the audience, and his views surrounding the roles of education for the Black population likely swayed many of the audience that day. And for certain, he started to really steer the policies surrounding segregation during his political career. When Oklahoma formally became a state, the first law that was passed was Senate Bill No. 1. And this segregation law promoted separate transportation facilities, but it also set the agenda of the Oklahoma legislature, who were enacting policies that targeted Black populations. Under the Oklahoma Constitution, people without African descent were classified as white. And this also included Native people, and they were to be segregated in schools. I assert that the underlying premise behind this classification was to provide access to tribal lands and resources. So if Native people were considered white, they were considered marriageable, and white men and women were allowed to marry Native people in some tribal nations, and this provided them access to allotment lands. In some tribal nations, it also provided them with tribal citizenship. So I write about this, and I include this because I think it's important to highlight the ways in which people within the territories were being racialized in different ways. And this profoundly affected the educational experiences of children. Many Seminole Freedpeople children were also greatly impacted by these decisions. But I also want to note that these methods of racialization really ignored their status, their political status as citizens of the Seminole Nation. As a result of state and federal legislation, the Seminole Freedpeople were targeted for their lands. In 1908, there was a restrictions bill that was passed to remove restrictions off of freedmen's lands, along with tribal people whose blood quantum was below 1/2 degree of Indian blood, and also intermarried whites. So federal restrictions was kind of a conundrum. So on one hand, there were restrictions that made it difficult to sell land without oversight from the federal government. On the other hand, it sometimes served as a form of protection because opportunists usually didn't want to go through the red tape of lifting restrictions. However, this removal of restrictions undoubtedly contributed to the loss of lands at an accelerated rate for the Seminole Freedpeople. The loss of land was also documented during interviews with some of the Freedpeople students. Primus Dean, who attended school at the Miccosukee Mission, where He talked about how his mom actually lost land because Mr. Ferguson, the school superintendent at the time, was gobbling up the land. And so when allotments were distributed, it's almost as soon as allotments were distributed, land grifters really began targeting lands. So James Cody Johnson, again, he was educated at a Seminole school. He actually became one of the lawyers who represented free people's interests in court. And he proved to be very instrumental to the protection of rights for the people. In 1908, there was a newspaper article that reported that he represented the Muskogee and Seminole Freedpeople in their objections to removal of restrictions. He reported that the freed people had lost their surplus land without governmental protections, and that in less than 6 months' time, the grafters would take over all of the homesteads that they could get their hands on. And he further cited cases in which the grafters utilized forgery and perjury to obtain freedmen land. Some of the grafters were representatives of the very same schooling system, Seminole schooling systems for the Seminoles. The U.S. Superintendent of Emmahaga School, Walter Ferguson, was one of those individuals. And Primus Dean was the one he talked about that his mother had lost her allotment because Mr. Ferguson was gobbling up the land. After 4 years of legal wrangling over the issue of free people land allotments, the Supreme Court issued a decision in 1912. And the report said the restriction upon the alienation of homestead lands applied as well as to the freedmen as to the other allottees, but it was removed with respect to the freedmen by the Act of May 27, 1908. And so the land titles to the former Seminole Nation were on par and open, similar to those of the other 5 tribes. The Wewoka Democrat, a local newspaper, reported, "Now watch us grow. Already loan companies are making arrangements to enter this field. The uncertainty of titles and the doubts raised by the Interior Department in the plain acts of Congress has heretofore been the greatest obstacles placed in the development of our county. The Supreme Court has rolled these obstacles away, but it has been a long, weary fight, 8 long, lean, lank, hungry years since the Act of 1904. It took courage, perseverance, and patience to stand the ideal. The pioneers of Seminole County braved the ordeal of federal lawsuits and many discouragements before the goal was reached. All credit to them for standing steadfast. They will now reap the reward they so richly deserve." So we really see the ramifications of federal and state formation start to really affect the schools and the loss of land. So I think about what happened to some of those community schools when these policies were taking place. With Emmahaga School, there was a formidable opponent to some of these policies, and her name was actually Alice Brown Davis. Alice Brown was the daughter of Lucy Redbeard, and she belonged to the Tiger Clan. Her father was Lucy's husband, Dr. John Frippo Brown, who had met Lucy when he had served as a government doctor during the removal time. Intermarriage between white people and the Seminole were unlawful in the Seminole Nation. So Alice was actually born in the Cherokee Nation. Although her father was a physician who wrote about ailments and the medicinal use of plants, it was her mother, Lucy, who had shared her knowledge of these medicines with him. Young Alice was afforded private education, and when it was safe for them to do so, they finally moved into the Seminole Nation, and she began to attend the Seminole mission schools at a young age. She followed her parents into a life of service to the Seminole people. She accompanied her father on his medical rounds and assisted during a great cholera epidemic, which would end up claiming both of her parents' lives. And after her parents passed away, she moved in with her brother and began her service as a teacher within the Seminole Nation. She taught at the Saukwa School and the Miccosukee Mission School for Boys. After her marriage in the early 1870s, Alice Brown Davis was a renowned businesswoman along with her husband. They owned a ranch, they had a store, they had 10 children who grew up in the Seminole Nation. She was also a devout Christian, and she made the church a central part of her children's lives. She was also bilingual in both the Seminole language and in English, and it is likely that she was one of the few English speakers within the Seminole Nation, so there would have been a very special responsibility to her people. She was appointed as the superintendent of Emmahaga School in 1905, and that following year, she joined her brother in resisting the takeover of Seminole schools. Her brother was serving as the leader of the Seminole Nation, and during that time, the United States Congress passed the 5 Civilized Tribes Act, which was a resounding attack on tribal sovereignty. The act was to provide for the final disposition of the affairs of the 5 tribes in the Indian Territory and for other purposes. The act also outlined enrollment rules, established the completion of the Dawes rolls, the removal of principal chiefs, abolished tribal taxes, disestablished the tribal land offices, moved records to United States courts, and authorized payments to loyal Seminoles, among other people. A significant component to the act was really directed towards control of the schools. And the act authorized the Secretary of the Interior to fully take control of tribal schools, along with all land and property. And they outlined their plans to control the school systems until such a time as a public school system has been established under territorial or state government. It also seized the funds that were belonged to the 5 tribes that was meant to pay for education. So this new legislation legalized the possession of the government, like all of the school buildings, the furniture, and the government ended up placing those belongings up for appraisal and put them up for sale. And what remained of tribal lands was to be held in trust. The tribal nations swiftly protested this act, and her advocacy continued well into the 20th century as state formation was being approached. By November of 1906, newspapers were reporting that Benedict, the US superintendent, had ordered Governor Brown to turn over Emmahaga School and described the Seminoles' actions as that they had been holding their own school by force. In fact, the United States government was actually seizing a building that the Seminole Nation had constructed and furnished with their own funds. Another newspaper reported that Governor Brown just refused to do so, to turn over the school. And he was really aided in this matter by Alice. Alice had been nominated to serve as superintendent. Her children had attended school there, and it was really a place that was held in high regard throughout the Seminole Nation. Editorials written about her highlight how she was really well versed in the nation's business. She also helped in enrolling Seminole babies before the Dawes Commission. And when it came to the matter of the school, she really stood firm in her position that school oversight should remain under tribal control. And so there were editorials written all about her, about how she was refusing to give up this control of the school. She actually knew that because her contract was signed before this act was legislated, that she utilized that to her advantage. And so she actually brought a suit against the government and said that, no, my contract was in place before this date of dissolution with tribal governments. So the AG of the United States actually stepped in, denied her suit, and actually their policy was to oust her from the school leadership. Although the federal government ended up taking over the schools, when Emmahaga closed down, the school tract really remained an important site for our people. There were memories there, and it served as a reminder of the efforts our people had made in order to provide an education for our students. And although she had made this effort to retain control, she was actually succeeded by Ferguson, and he was the one that was the land thief who was, I always say he was disguised as a government agent. He really exploited the people of the Seminole Nation. He amassed a large number of land titles, and I found letters where he was writing for permission to graze his own cattle on the school tract. Under the leadership of the federal government, we actually closed the school down. And by 1919, the tract was really started to be appraised by the United States Interior. Superintendent of the tribes notified the United States oil inspector of the potential for oil on the school tract. And so they were trying to sell it for $25 an acre. So there was really starting to be an exploration and encouragement for oil exploration on tribal lands. On May 26, 1920, the Interior Department authorized the sale of Alice Brown Davis's beloved Emmahaga School to be sold at a public auction. And the Seminole Nation protested this action. It was an illegal sale. And when they put up the property for bid, the winning bidder was actually Walter Ferguson, the superintendent of the school. And the terms of the sale were really extremely generous to him. We actually brought litigation against the United States for the illegal sale of the property, because at that time, oil was really proliferating within the Seminole Nation. And when the first oil site was discovered, oil was really being produced at 3,500 barrels of oil a day. And so that discovery of oil affected tribal citizens from that point. And so even today, our land is still mired in fractionated interest and convoluted mazes of oil leases. But there were also, it was also a time when a lot of people lost their lives. Again, you start to see land grifters coming and taking over and serving as guardians of children because they were wanting access to this land for oil leases. And they really capitalized on the fact that monolingual speakers at that time of the language, of our language, were not really considered capable of handling their own affairs. So that's the way the US government viewed them. So when it came time to the sale of this land, Alice actually she had actually been appointed as chief of the Seminole Nation. So she had a presidential appointment on May 23rd. And when she became chief of the Seminole Nation, she protested this the sale of the school. And she refused to sign off on the title that would transfer ownership of this property. She asserted that she brought a suit again against the government, and she said, this is sold without our consent. And she highlighted the reasons why she wouldn't sign off on the sale. So because she wouldn't sign off and no other leader would sign off on the sale, the Interior Secretary actually ended up signing off, and he said he was going to sign off and give permission because no one in the Seminole Nation would do that. So in her remarks and in her suit that she brought, she made this quote that I've put here, and she said, "For me to sign this deed would be a grave injustice to the Seminole, to the tribe, and it's not keeping in the trust imposed on me as chief." And I really look at her time with the Seminole Nation as she has a legacy that's rooted in service to the people. And we see throughout the history of education within the Seminole Nation that there were women that were leading our nation through education. So I think about Louisa Bruner and Alice Brown Davis, and how they had this knowledge that the needs of the collective of the people should always outweigh the needs of the individual. And you really see that in their stories. These stories that emanate from the history of our schools really highlight the connection between settler colonization, their powerful officials, and subsequent greed for land and resources. The Seminole Nation was actually the last of the 5 tribes to lose control of institutions of learning. Our people had been, up until that time, we had been successfully educating our children from time immemorial. And although it might have looked different over generations, our people were still transmitting values that had sustained our people. So to hand over control of our children, it was an issue that our people would resist in really powerful ways. The Seminole Nation very much desired to retain forms of their education, educating their children with an inherent right to determine what that education would look like. Our people had fought through wars. We had survived in a new homeland, and we really faced challenges together. And the Seminole Nation schools really represented, I feel, the very best of the nation's endeavors, because education of children was a nationwide effort to protect the people. The history within education with our nation highlights the resistance of our people to really determine education and our future of our people. Thank you. Mado.
Thank you so much, Dr. Johnson. This was an incredible presentation. So we're now going to open the floor to questions. So feel free to use the raise your hand feature, pop a question in the Q&A, and let's get the ball rolling. I see that Adria Merritt has her hand raised, so I'm going to allow you to speak, to ask your question. Adria, are you available? Okay, we're gonna move up, we'll come back to you. We're gonna move to Geeta Patel.
Hi, that was absolutely fantastic, Dr. Johnson. I actually been teaching work on Oklahoma and the history of indigenous translocation, forced relocation since the 1990s. And also sort of trying to think about the question of land acquisition, land seizure, and boarding schools, because I'm interested in the history of boarding schools across different parts of the world, right? So also studying that relationship between the conversion of land into property and the conversion of children into property, right? Look at South Asian orphan schools that was started in the 1700s. So it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, it was just a delight to hear this. I have one question. I mean, I went to a Scottish Presbyterian mission school myself, and which was, started in the 1700s. And one of the things because I've been writing about colonialism for a long time and thinking about it for a long time. And one of the things that I found, and thinking about the notion of property as you are in a really complex way for a long time. And one of the things that I think that I've been struggling with is the question of, I mean, if you want property of the soul, right? Literally, like the property of living, what I think of as living belonging. And so the thing that, I mean, looking at the orphan schools and my own school, one of the things that happened was Christianity actually took a piece of my soul away, right? And, so, and part of the project of Christian missionizing, however much it was, I mean, it's very complicated. This goes on, this is a longer discussion because it goes on in the contemporary period and in South Asia, specifically with indigenous communities. I wouldn't call myself indigenous. I call myself a South Asian settler colonialist. But it's stronger with indigenous communities in South Asia right now. So there's a work that Christianity does, which takes something away. So I wondered, and it's the relationship to the earth, right? And I was wondering if that's something you would be willing to talk about, even in its best features, right? So even with indigenous missionaries who start schools that actually are in multiple languages, like Alice, with Alice, I mean, it's something that I've been, the loss of the tongue, literally losing your tongue in relation to living being is something, and just literally, I mean, I call it cutting the tongue, right? And so I've been thinking about this a long time and the brutality of it and what it means. So I'd love you to, if you could, think through that with me. In education, land is living earth and being, and then religion and tongue. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to respond. So I'm thinking in my community in particular. So right, when we were removed to this place, like it was a total different ecological environment. So those ties were really severed. But I will say this, our people's resistance was that they actually brought things from the old homelands with them. And I would say, as far as religion, it looked very different here in Indian Territory. So when missionaries were coming to this area, they realized that they could not reach our people through the foreign language of English, right? So one of the Presbyterian ministers, Ramsey, that was in the area, like he took it upon himself to really learn the Muskogee language, because he said, I want to learn. He went to the Choctaw Nation and saw that the ministers there were conversing in Choctaw, and he was jealous of that. And he wanted to learn to really speak and to orate in the Muskogee language, because he felt that he would get more souls in that way. So yes, I definitely see this competition over souls, because he mentions that in his journal. But I also want to speak to the resistance of our people. And I will say this today, because, when some of these curriculum materials, even though they had a Christian influence, they were still being written in our language. They were still, even the orthography that was developed along that line.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually served as, it really bolstered like bilingual education.
Mm-hmm.
To this day, our people still utilize, like there were hymns that were written
Mm-hmm.
in our
Mm-hmm.
language. Our
Mm-hmm.
people still, like, it's very strong tradition in our community that our people
Mm-hmm.
still sing those hymns. And like
Mm-hmm.
I hear some of the hymns, and some of them, like I can really, like, sometimes like you just feel the emotion that's evoked in some of
Mm-hmm.
them.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to say that it was like our people just gave up. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
it was just a new way. And if you go to some of the Seminole, even some of the Seminole churches today, like they're still organized in the way that our people have been organized
Mm-hmm.
time immemorial. So like one example I can say is that like at the churches, the doors always face east.
Mm-hmm.
That's where
Yes,
so like
the rising sun, yeah.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
feel like even though that this was a mission to save souls, right? Like our people
Mm-hmm.
made it into something that was theirs. And
Mm-hmm.
so I really just see that. And even today, it's still really, really strong in our community. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. It's really, it's interesting to think about. I mean, I don't know if you know the historian Jeff Cox's work, COX. I mean, he's actually looked at South Asian sort of language, churches in South Asian that translated Bibles into South Asian languages, and sort of thought through some of the same questions you were talking about and some of the same answers you've given. So, yeah, so thank you for that.
I had a question in terms of your methodology. So you started the talk with this really just basically talking about how difficult it is to tell this story because you're reading against the grain. You're going, like, you are looking for a story that has been both at some points ignored, but at other points actively silenced. And so I wanted to hear more about, what was that like what, in terms of your research in the archives, what kind of sources did you draw upon? Was the archive sufficient? Like, did you have to find, like, did you have to look for sources through other areas and other spaces? So I just kind of wanted to hear more about the actual sources that you use, but also how you use those sources.
So I actually, and this was something that I had a hard time with when I was doing my dissertation research, because I was looking at, you look at other examples of, historian work, and everything that, like, I knew some of the stories of the school. So like Emmahaga School, I used to work in Wewoka, and I lived at my grandma's house in a community called Kanawha, outside of Kanawha. And I used to drive every day to Wewoka, which was about a maybe 25-30-minute drive. And every day I would pass this pasture, and I'd see this chimney that was there. And it was just like a lone chimney and a cow pasture. And I knew that that was where Emmahaga School was. And I knew that that was the site. And the reason why I had known that is because my uncle had told us stories about that. And it's the same route I used to take my grandma to the clinic. And so, they would share stories on the drive about, oh, our family used to live here. And when she was a little girl, she talked about how they would actually live. And I think they were kind of like military tents. And so I really drew up on stories from my community. Because I really see those as valid. And I know that in academia, like, people are so like, let's see what's in these archival institutions. But I think it's so important to take stories also from the community, because, I just know just from experience that, these stories have been passed down. And I wanted to make sure that I was including that type and really highlighting that type of knowledge system. So that was really important to me. With the archive, so I kind of fell into this work because I was actually going to do work on kind of teacher education. And I ended up working as a graduate student at the Western History Collections at the University of Oklahoma. And oh my gosh, like I like being able to go in the stacks and see photos, and I found like a whole collection on just Miccosukee Mission pictures, and I was just like, I need to tell this story. So that was a really good experience. And you know, I had a great chair, Dr. Velasquez, and I moved over into her program, and that really influenced me. But there was also differences that I faced, like whenever I went into federal archives. A lot of our records are held in Fort Worth at one of the United States archival institutions. And that experience was really different for me. And it was hard to read because sometimes I'd come across medical records, and you know, I had to think about whether I wanted to include those, and I was just like, no. And I remember looking through and thinking, I hope my grandma's medical records aren't in this stack of papers that are located in this archive for just anybody to see. So there was also that invasiveness that, you know, you kind of feel like when you see kind of those things. So that was something that was really difficult for me, but it also brought me joy too, because, you know, I knew my grandma had attended Miccosukee Mission when it was co-ed. And I used to watch, I always tell the story about, I used to watch her when she would sign her name. And when she would sign her name, she would sign real slow, like she would take her time with her signature. And other times I'd see her just sign with the X. And I didn't know that my grandma didn't write, like somebody had taught her how to write her name. And so when I was in the federal archives and I saw her name, like with her school record, as far as what grade she was going in, I was like, oh my gosh, there's my grandma. So that was also kind of neat too. So I would say it was just very personal, very kind of emotional at times too, to find these records. And so I really looked at wanting to privilege the really knowledge systems from our community first, and making sure that these were illuminated in some of the stories.
Thank you. I think we have time for one short question. I'm not sure if anyone. All right, well, thank you. Thanks. Oh, Dr. Aldridge, go ahead.
Thank you again, Dr. Johnson, for a superb talk. I really enjoyed it and took a lot of notes. And I want to kind of piggyback off of a question that Alexa asked regarding methodology. Could you tell us how you went about putting your stories together? What were some of the challenges, and what were some of, because I'm trying to get into the storytelling thing too. So I'm just curious, you know, how you did it.
Oh man, that was hard because, you know, I look at a lot of historical work, and sometimes people use timelines, but sometimes like some of the stories didn't exactly fit in a timeline, like it would fit better with the different narratives. So I really tried to weave those stories into my writing, just because it's tough to do, and especially with this huge amount of time. So that's one of the things that I would do. And when I first started my project, I actually wanted to write vignettes of maybe a fictionalized account in between these chapters. But then, you know, dissertation time, you're just like, get it done. So someday I might want to go do that, because there are stories, you know, that I would like to put in. Like, you know, when I think about when statehood was being approached, and, you know, my grandma was born in 1915. And thinking about that time frame when oil exploration began. So there are these stories that still need to be told. And I hope to someday do those, but that's the only way I could just figure out how to do it, was kind of sometimes thematically, sometimes timeline wise. I would just kind of it was just very a recursive process. And it is difficult. Yeah. I will say that.
Thank you so much. That's very informative. Appreciate you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, thank you again, Dr. Johnson, for joining us today for the Race and Education lecture. So I've known Dr. Johnson for a little bit, and it's always, I have to say, it's always a pleasure to hear your presentations. You have an incredible way of connecting your rich personal history to your excellent work as a historian. So I know I can speak for everyone when I say we're very honored and fortunate to have you here today.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for the invitation. And I'm at the University of Oklahoma. So if anybody needs to reach me, you can always look me up there.
Just before we close out, I did want to make a quick plug. So please follow our CRPES social media channels for regular updates and lecture series announcements. You could visit our website to view our upcoming events, download iCals, and save Zoom information. So thank you again for attending this session, and enjoy the rest of your day.